Oh, I was doing this again. It always does something. It won't get rid of that now. So I got to do this. Bring it back up. I know. It's so frustrating. It'll come back up. So you know it works. We are recording, which is good. Okay, can we get everybody into their everybody? Almost everybody, couple stragglers making their way. We'll just give another couple minutes. We're all for recording.
I'm not relaxed, but I'm here.
Get rid of that top bar.
I can just do a click through and that should, yeah, that should do me.
I'll say something. I'll let you go ahead and put this on. It's in. I knew it was.
Sorry. So,
And that's still recorded the whole time. Can we stop it? Record it right now to make it. Yeah. Yeah. Which means it's gonna be like a 400 gig file. or something. There are 50. Scotch fingers. Everybody. Okay, everybody. Everybody together. Herding cats, I swear to God.
academics, this is a joke all the time. It's like herding cats, 100%.
One wanders off bathroom. Go. Okay, everybody, grab our seats, please. Thank you. So, really excited to welcome Dr. Shea Esterling, who is at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch in Aotearoa, New Zealand. He's going to be talking to us about legal frameworks. Well, you can read the title, but he's going to be talking to us about legal frameworks for Indigenous knowledges, space, and dark skies. I do apologize because we have to go, but we got a great recording of this. We're going to get online shortly after.
Brilliant. Right. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko te mihi tuatahi ki a rangi ki runa. Ki a papa ki raro tēnei koura. Ki te huna mate, moi mai rā, moi mai rā, moi mai rā. A tato ki huna, ora tēnā tato katoa. Tiene te mihi kana, tangata take. Ti kaitiaki o nā whenua, o tu ahitiria, o rite ki te mana whenua, o whenua he nai tua riri. No rai morai ora, ko wai tiene, hi pukena, ahu ki te whare wanana o Waitaha, ko Shea Esterling toku ingoa. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Much appreciated for you all to be here. I began by paying my respects to the Indigenous peoples of Australia and also paying my respects to the Indigenous peoples on whose land that I work and live, the Ngāitua Ririri. It feels appropriate to begin a conversation about legal knowledges in relation to Indigenous peoples, Indigenous rights, and dark skies by giving that presentation and beginning that presentation in Te Reo Māori, on the land in which I work and live. So who is this person that is standing in front of you right now? I am trained as a lawyer, worked as a lawyer for a couple of years. Do not recommend it. Don't tell my first year students that. Definitely do not recommend it. But it didn't mean that I didn't like the law. It just means I wanted to do something else with my law degree. So I went back and I did a PhD, and my PhD looks at the intersection between international cultural heritage law and Indigenous rights. And at that intersection, we find questions such as, is there an international human right to the repatriation of cultural property for Indigenous peoples under international law? So that's my background, and that's where I'm coming from. But more recently, I've been pulled into this world of cultural astronomy. And I was pulled in by a colleague, an astronomer at the University of Canterbury, where I'm located, who said, I'm interested in knowing more about heritage. I want a heritage lawyer to look at things in space. And my mind was instantly blown. It was something that I had never thought of or never considered before, the application of heritage, heritage laws, Indigenous rights, and human rights to space. So that's kind of the story of how I got here. Next week at the conference, I'll talk specifically about the project that I'm working on in this area. But today, I'd like to talk to you about and give you an overview of the laws and legal frameworks that are pertinent to Indigenous knowledges and the protection of dark skies. Now, this will be an Aotearoa New Zealand centric focused talk in a certain sense, particularly when I'm talking about domestic laws and designing legislation for the protection of dark skies. But hopefully it can serve as a model, and there is international content in here as well that's applicable across a broad range of states. So in 2022, New Zealand Parliament passed the Matariki Public Holiday Act, making the Māori New Year celebration of Matariki a public holiday. Now, I've included here on the slide for you this act in its English translation. And this is pretty much the bulk of the act. It's not particularly long. And what I would ask you to do is to have a read through this and think about what features or what things about this act stand out to you. So holiday. What else did I hear? Royal assent.
Single day of the year.
Yeah. True. Yeah. Okay, so for Māori in general, as opposed to a particular iwi. Yeah, okay.
Law, traditions, and traditions all have the same calendrical system.
And recognition of this in the act itself, so the actual.
Like
homogenization, recording of oral, yeah, traditions, culture, recording. Yeah. Ladies, yeah. Okay. I'm gonna lasso you all into my law classes. Now, interestingly, and we'll circle round to what everyone said. So we're talking about providing or making the Maori New Year, Matariki, a public holiday. And you're absolutely right. It does shift year by year because it has to do with the particular lunar cycle. And that's been decided for the next 30 years out, I believe, by the committee that co-manages, is co-involved with this legislation, a Maori committee who decides on these dates. So they do fluctuate from year to year. Typically, Matariki, June, July-ish time. So this year it was on the 20th, and I can remember that 20th of June because that was the day I flew out to come to Australia, and all the celebrations were in fact that evening. So clearly its purpose is to make Matariki a public holiday. You've kind of got the technical side of things at section 2, simply talking about when it commences, the day after the date on which it receives royal assent. So this is in all of our laws. It states upon which it will begin, and of course requiring that royal assent. And we'll come back to this idea of the relationship between royal, the crown, and Māori, and that relationship in New Zealand. But section 3, which many of you focused on or pointed out, talking about Matariki is the Māori name for Pleiades. So talking about how it does center it in relation, or it positions it in relation to Western concepts. It talks about recording these sorts of oral histories and traditions included in legislation. And we increasingly see this more and more in New Zealand legislation, where we will have these sorts of statements at the beginning that are written by Māori, recording their oral histories and sharing their stories. So this is a relatively new feature that we've seen probably in about the last 10 years or so across a variety of different pieces of legislation, particularly environmental legislation. I'm not sure here in Australia, but Te Awa Tupua, the Whanganui River being made a legal person in 2017, again, acts like that, including this at the beginning. Now, it talks about that it requires the appearance of Matariki in the winter sky. It talks about the rising of Matariki. It then talks again about its appearance, the rising of stars, and again, star again. So implicit in this, and this oral tradition that we're told about, what do we need? We need to be able to see the stars that make up Matariki. That's not explicitly stated here, but it's implicit in what is provided to us by Māori in recording their traditions around New Year. So we need to be able to actually see the stars of Matariki. Does this mention anything about the environment, the sky, dark skies? So there is a distinct lack of reference to the environment. In fact, there's no reference to the environment whatsoever in the legislation. There are 2 mentions of the sky, one of them that I've highlighted there. There's another mention of the sky earlier in its preamble, which I left out. And there's absolutely no mention of the night sky or nighttime or dark skies in any way. None of that. Yes, please.
The star.
Yeah. Is the
It might be misinterpreted, but then
Matariki is the star of the Maori New Year.
does it mean that is the actual thing in the sky, or is it star meaning being the most important thing?
I think meaning the most important thing, because it is, in fact, I don't want to, because I fear you all as cultural astronomers. It's a cluster, am I allowed to say a cluster, constellation? And, yeah. And we'll look at those stars individually as we progress. Yes.
Yeah. Also, it makes appealing to the idea of people observing, but in the description, they talk about the rising in terms of, mathematical astronomy, because it's not written any specific reference to the situation of observation. Kind of yeah.
So there's nothing in here that actually fleshes out any of these other details. So what does this mean for us? How should we understand this legislation? Well, if we take it here together, there are standout features. So one we've already mentioned, and that is, in terms of perhaps a positive, we can see that the Act includes or documents Indigenous narratives and knowledges, Maori history and culture. And that is provided by Maori themselves, who are involved in drafting the legislation. Yet, as we've noted, it makes little reference to the sky, 2 references in total, no reference to the environment, and no reference to dark skies, in particular, the need for dark skies and their protection. And this should seem strange to us, given that it is predicated on being able to see the stars that are in this cluster of Matariki, again known as Pleiades. And then I also discovered 7 sisters and Freya's hens, which I also enjoyed from Norse mythology as well. So in understanding this sort of legislation, it's very common in New Zealand, as I said, to include the sort of documentation of oral stories and Māori narratives and knowledge, at least on the surface. We have the words in the Act, right? But if we can dig a little bit deeper, we can see that this legislation actually fails Māori because it lacks these references to actually being able to see the stars and the protection of the environment, our near-Earth environment, and our protection of dark skies. So in this sort of way, I would view this legislation as a little bit of cultural lip service. To truly be able to fulfill Māori aspirations as explained by Māori peoples in relation to the celebration of the new year, it is absolutely crucial to be able to see Matariki, to see that group of stars. And yet the legislation ignores that. It does the very easy thing of creating obligations on the part of the Crown filtered down to local councils to make sure that local councils provide a public holiday and celebrations for Matariki. And ironically, these celebrations, if you have a click on that link later, these celebrations initially in 2022 included fireworks celebrations. Now, I'm not an astronomer, but my guess is fireworks don't make it easier to see the dark night sky. And yet this is what local councils engaged in as the way to celebrate Matariki. As you can imagine, not consulting with Maori about what would be appropriate here. Now, I have learned that since around 2023, 4-ish, most councils have begun consultation and most councils no longer have fireworks shows. Not all councils, but most councils no longer have it. But nonetheless, what continues to remain, including up to this year, June 20th, as I was leaving Christchurch, is that there are still massive light installations across the country in most major cities, and drone air shows that purport to light up the skies to celebrate Matariki. I don't think the message is quite getting through. So, again, all of this leads me to the conclusion that it's a little bit of cultural lip service. It does what the law often does in relation to Indigenous rights, and it does the easy things. It talks about culture, making space for culture, recognizing a holiday or a festivity or a tradition, but it doesn't do the hard work that's actually required to make that meaningful. i.e., for instance, in many cases, providing Indigenous peoples with land back, providing for self-determination, giving Indigenous peoples the right and the role to speak in relation to these sorts of cultural activities. So I think at this point in time, it's safe to say that what we have in that legislation is a little bit of lip service. Now, I don't say that to denigrate the hard work of Māori activists, scholars, academics, everyday people in getting that legislation passed. An Indigenous people's agency acting to make that happen. It's not a denigration of that in any way. But I say it to be mindful of the fact that we need to push further and we need to keep continuing to push further. So if we pushed further and we had legislation that actually protected our dark skies to give real meaning to or teeth to Matariki as a public holiday, that would involve, as I said, protecting our dark skies against artificial light at night, or ALAN. Get all my little animations up there. So ALAN, very briefly, won't go into much detail here, is essentially indiscriminate light at night. It's a product of our human activity in our planetary environment. We can think of it as anthropogenic light pollution. And it comes from two sources. So unmitigated urban lighting that we have here on Earth. And then also this build out of this moving point of light in constellations, in effect, of satellites moving around our Earth in the near Earth environment. So these satellites and increasingly the space debris as well that reflects this sunlight. So that's what, at its core, this issue comes down to. So the near Earth environment, from this may not be as exciting for you, but as a lawyer, this was super exciting for me. Yeah, I got super excited. Got super excited. I don't even know. I can't. I won't respond. Quiet. Just gonna be quiet. So the near Earth environment, a close place, so up to 100 kilometers. And then after that, as you say, space. So for me, what I found very mind-blowing is that I always try to think about, well, what is 100 kilometers from where I'm at and where I'm speaking? So for us here, space then is closer than the Great Ocean Road or Anglesey, if we put it in that sort of context. And both space and our near Earth environment are full of activity. It is both tangible and intangible. We have a physical environment that we perceive through sight, sound, but also intangible in that it is a place in which activities occur. Of course, the satellites and the debris up there are obviously tangible items. So regarding artificial light at night, a few fast stats here for you to let you see the scope or the scale of the problem that we have. So pulling from the New World Atlas of Artificial Night Sky Brightness, it shows us that more than 80% of the world and that more than 99% of US and European populations live under night polluted skies. But it can't be that bad down here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, can it? I mean, after all, we have numerous areas designated as international dark sky sites or reserves by the organization Dark Sky International. And in Aotearoa, New Zealand, 53% of our motu, or our islands, area falls within some of the darkest skies on the planet. If we look based on land area, 74% of our North Island and 93% of our South Island, where I live there, has night skies that were either pristine or degraded only near the horizon, according to this report. And indeed, the spatial area of Aotearoa, New Zealand, impacted by direct illumination is very low. But the intense urbanization of our population in New Zealand means that only 3% of the people on our motu regularly experience dark skies. In fact, 56% of New Zealand's population can no longer see the Milky Way in winter. And the average rate of increase in the spatial area of light emissions in New Zealand was 4.2% between 2012 and 2021, placing it above the global average rate. Despite all of this, there is still the quite frequent perception that Aotearoa, New Zealand has pristine, unpolluted dark skies. And this is reinforced in advertising and tourism. I always have quite liked this Bank of New Zealand ad. The people of New Zealand always find a way, and they always have a dark sky and the stars guiding them. And there are many others, Kathmandu ads, the list goes on. But at present, in New Zealand, there is no explicit law protecting dark skies. And this is true not only at the domestic level, but also at the international level. So I'll start internationally and then work my way down to the domestic level in New Zealand. So under international law, there is no law protecting dark skies. At best, we have what is known as the La Palma Declaration. So actually, technically, Declaration in Defense of the Night Sky, but more commonly known as the La Palma Declaration. Now, as the name suggests here, it is in fact a declaration. So it is soft law. It is not binding. It does not create obligations that are enforceable. It is an aspirational document saying, yay, we should protect dark skies. I mean, I'm sure it says it more formally and in a much more academic sense, but in effect, aspirational. That's what it does. And the remainder of outer space law is also not particularly helpful for us here, either for the protection of dark skies and also protection of Indigenous rights. Article 7 of the OST, and I believe we've mentioned this a couple times over the past few days, so the Outer Space Treaty, Article 7 makes state parties liable for damage caused by their objects or its component parts, including objects and parts launched by private actors in that state's territory. But what the reality is that most small diameter space debris is not actually attributed to any particular party of origin in the era of new space. New space, you say? What is new space? Space 4.0, it's happening now. So in new space, or space 4.0, there's little clarity as to who is the procuring and consequently who is the launching state that has responsibility. Given the fact that in space 4.0, there's an increasingly complex web of multiple state actors and private entities involved in such endeavors. And the progression here from, in simplest terms, is initially when we think about space and the start of the space race in the 50s, the primary actors were states. So you can think of the Cold War, USSR, US. But that is now changing, and that is changing rapidly. So the introduction of private actors, of companies, of individuals, of universities, and as the costs decrease and the ability to make these things like CubeSats and all the other fancy things that science I don't understand, but as those costs decrease, things will continue to go up and to go up at a more rapid rate. And what this means is, for us, is that the increase in sky brightness becomes increasingly difficult to attribute to any particular party due to its aggregate global effect. So in turn, damage to our space environment is externalized onto all of humanity in general, offering no real protection for dark skies. If we move beyond outer space law, there are other potential options for the protection of dark skies. And so this was something that I told you an astronomer kind of lassoed me in and said, I need someone to think about heritage in relation to space. So this was my thinking in relation to it. So what could these other options be besides space law? Well, if we take an anthropogenic lens, especially taking into consideration Indigenous peoples' relationships with the night sky, there are various international laws which are pertinent to the protection of dark skies, even though none of these actually explicitly mention space and dark skies. In particular, in the view of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the night sky, it's evident that there's a close connection between the preservation of these skies and the cultural and spiritual well-being of Indigenous peoples. Further, this relationship is pertinent to fulfilling a variety of other Indigenous rights, including rights to knowledges, health, language, education, religion, and self-determination. So consequently, through this anthropogenic lens, the most relevant frameworks that we could also consider are international heritage law, human rights law, and Indigenous rights. And so that's exactly what I did. What could these potentially offer? Unfortunately, none of these international frameworks are completely fit for the purpose of protecting the night sky from ALAN, this artificial light at night. Rather, what they do is they offer a patchwork of protections that have significant gaps. So without going into the nitty-gritty of all these areas of law, kind of summing up here, for instance, in relation to heritage law, the shifting or the transient nature of what the night sky is like itself, this transient nature, that excludes it explicitly from protection under the World Heritage Convention. The World Heritage Convention means that only states have the power to delineate a property as cultural or natural heritage if it's under their jurisdiction. And as the sky, in particular the night sky, is not under the jurisdiction of any state, the consequence is that any protection that it might offer is beyond the reach of the World Heritage Convention. When we look at Indigenous rights, we have the UNDRIP, which was mentioned in our previous presentation a bit earlier in the afternoon. Again, as the name suggests, UNDRIP, UN declaration, it's a declaration, so it is soft law. It does not create binding, enforceable obligations. And as regards human rights law, to the extent that they do create binding obligations, there is not consistent application and there's not consistent enforcement due to the lack of an international sovereign. So we thought, let's turn to domestic law and see what is on offer in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Well, it's a very similar situation as to what exists under international law. There is no specific law for the protection of dark skies in New Zealand. And again, taking this anthropogenic lens, the type of legislation here that might be pertinent, even though it doesn't explicitly address or talk about dark skies, again, are environmental laws, heritage laws, and local council regulations. So, for instance, let's take our environmental laws in this. So if we look at the Resource Management Act of 1991, which I need to, a little caveat on, it's undergoing significant reform at the moment. The previous government had divvied it into 3 new pieces of legislation and kind of beefed it and bulked it up. Then we had an election and the new government said, no, we're not going to do that. Scrapped it and now is under redesign. We don't know what's happening and when it's happening. So we still have RMA 1991. Well, most importantly here, there are jurisdictional issues as the RMA deals with on-the-ground activities. It's not intended to manage the effects of activities in space. Under Part 3, the RMA manages the use of land, the coastal marine area, and water. As defined in the RMA, land includes the airspace above the Earth's surface, but does not apply to overflying aircraft. Moreover, the RMA does not explicitly include spacecraft. Any potential jurisdiction here that a local council may have would stop at the boundary between the atmosphere and space. So I found a bit of case law here, actually asking this very, very question and confirming this. So the management of the effects of satellites in dark skies would also then be outside the scope of any provisions that the district or the local council might make under the authority of the RMA. Now, beyond these pieces of domestic legislation, the closest that we get for the protection of dark skies is our Outer Space and High Altitude Activities Act 2017, or OSHA. So OSHA meets our responsibilities under the Outer Space Treaty System. So the situation there was quite interesting. So New Zealand signed and ratified all of those space law treaties that we looked at previously on a few slides back. It did so in the 60s and 70s, and then it didn't do anything else. It ratified them and then just let them be. Well, that's problematic in a system like New Zealand, as in many systems. You actually have to pass legislation to implement and to enforce those international treaty obligations. They are not directly enforceable in states without implementing legislation in many countries. They're a dualist system, so it requires that local act. And New Zealand didn't do that. So it ratified them, they exist out there at the international level, but it didn't do anything at the domestic level. And then you get Rocket Lab coming along with Peter Beck launching the Humanities Star in about 2015-ish or so. And New Zealand realized we should probably go ahead and pass some legislation that implements our outer space law treaty obligations. And so that's when you get OSHA in 2017, so 2 years after Rocket Lab and Peter Beck had that launch. Now, what do we have in here? Well, it makes no provision for protecting the night sky from ALAN. The closest it gets is at Regulation 13, which sets out the requirement for an orbital debris mitigation plan. And this is the only reference to the environment in OSHA. Further, there's no provision for any liability in relation to the debris itself. So the liability flows from if you don't have the plan. It's not even about the debris itself. So liability is in relation to lack of inclusion of a plan. So again, under OSHA, the effect is that damage to the space environment is externalized onto all of humanity in general, offering no real protection for dark skies. But this is quite an unsurprising conclusion, given that OSHA simply implements the Outer Space Treaty, which, as we already said, does the same thing by just externalizing this all onto humanity. So it really just follows suit at the domestic level. So in New Zealand, there are no national laws that make explicit protection for the night sky from ALAN, from the near Earth environment. So that's the light in the forms of satellites and debris. At best, what we have in New Zealand is local regulations and district plans, which focus on minimizing light pollution. So that's that unmitigated urban lighting aspect of artificial light at night. Now, these plans vary widely across New Zealand. Some offer little to no protection, while we have others that offer quite high levels of protection. And those are the ones that coincide with our 9 dark sky reserves, which have been designated as such by the organization Dark Sky International. So Dark Sky International requires quite strict lighting plans to be considered a dark sky reserve. So obviously those 9 areas will have that in effect. But there's wide variation. And New Zealand is not alone in this lack of protection from Earth-based light pollution. In fact, very few countries have explicit protection for dark skies based on or coming from this unmitigated urban lighting. Dark Skies International has a nice list of what countries do and do not have legislation. The notable exceptions here are countries like France, Croatia, and Chile. They all have quite progressive domestic legislation in relation to light pollution coming from Earth. But New Zealand really is not alone here in not having this. So consequently, what we can see here is that in balancing these competing interests, which is in fact the core business of what law does, the balance in New Zealand is tipped in favor of commercial interests over those of protecting dark skies. In fact, in New Zealand, the protection of dark skies is not even on the scales at the national level. OSHA, if you'll remember, aims to strike a balance between safe regulation and space industry growth and development. So it's focusing on those. It's not even placing dark skies, environment, any of this onto the scale. It's not even one of the interests. It's measuring these other potentially competing interests. So it's not there at all. It's not even in their line of vision. And I think something else, perhaps I was talking with some of you at lunch about this, the other thing I think that's quite telling about OSHA is that it also sits within the Ministry for Business and Innovation, rather than, say, in the Ministry for Environment or Māori Ministry. It sits within business and innovation. So you can really see that neoliberal economic driver focus on commercial space for commercial purposes and development. Now, what is clear here is that none of these frameworks at either the domestic or the international level are actually fit for purpose for protecting dark skies. As noted, in part, this stems from the nature of the night sky itself. We talked about it being transient. It's not a consistent, defined place. And yet a lot of the protections that we talked about above in those frameworks are place-based protections, and so it's excluded. Aside from that, there's issues around scope, and we noted that there are challenges around interpretation, implementation, and enforcement with all of these frameworks, either being limited or at least inconsistent. However, perhaps most importantly, there is no owner of the night sky, just as there's no owner of any celestial bodies. In a juridical sense, the night sky is not property. It is not something that can be owned by any individual, group, or state. So this suggests that moving forward, any regulation for the protection of dark skies, including from light pollution, requires collective action and responsibility. This conclusion is not groundbreaking or earth-shaking. It is widely known that it requires collective action. And its challenges of creating collective action and fostering that sense of collective responsibility, again, is also very well rehearsed in the literature, especially in literature in relation to international law, specifically environmental law and space law. But this need for and the challenges of collective action does not preclude the development of legislation for the governance of dark skies in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which could serve as a model for other states and contribute to this idea or this push for collective action. Now, I will note to you, New Zealand is not on the map, and that happens literally all the time. Like, I mean, New Zealand, we're there all the time. I work with legal documents all the time, and my favorite one, perhaps, besides seeing this most recently, was in looking at the International Criminal Court's cultural heritage policy, a UN document, mind you, world map on the front, talking about common heritage, all of humankind at the UN. New Zealand didn't even make it. I mean, we fell off the side of the printer. So let's go, yep, I felt quite comforted knowing this happens everywhere. So anyway, what can we do here? Even though it requires this sort of collective action, we still, as a state, can make an effort to contribute to that and to serve as a model to help other states move forward and view how to protect our dark skies. In order to do this, though, what would such a law in New Zealand need to look like? Very firstly, it would need to be decoupled from an anthropocentric rights-focused discourse. So anthropocentrism is this idea, this belief that human beings are the most important entities on the planet. Humans alone possess intrinsic value, and everything else only holds value in relation to its ability to serve human beings. So in our discussion here, it's the idea that outer space and the near-Earth environment, including dark skies, only have instrumental value. They are a means to serve human ends. And it's this anthropocentric understanding which underpins, or is the theoretical framing of this aforementioned piecemeal legislation that we talked about in relation to protecting dark skies. Now, without going into the nitty-gritty and giving you all the examples that are in the broader paper, I just thought I'd shoot up here on the slide where you can see from some of these pieces of legislation at the international level that we talked about, how this anthropocentrism, how this idea that space, the environment, it is here to serve humankind. It's based or valued on and what it can do for human beings. So to combat this sort of idea that a regulatory framework to protect, do you need to come across? Ah, okay. To combat this, a regulatory framework to protect the night sky needs to be rooted in the recognition of the actual inherent value of the dark sky itself, independent of its relationship with human beings. So how do we go ahead and go about doing this? In New Zealand, this can be done by using Te Reo Maori as a lens to help design legislation for the protection of dark skies. So, unlike Indigenous rights at the international level that we looked at earlier, which are filtered through a Western lens, this kind of idea that there are somehow universal human rights, i.e., we know filtered through a Western lens. But Te Reo Maori, or this Maori worldview, presents an unfiltered Maori view of the world. And for Maori, and indeed for many Indigenous peoples, there's no concept of outer space, but rather a focus on a continuous and connected reality of coexistence. So, as my colleagues have described to me in New Zealand, for many Maori, recognizing that there are variations between various different iwi, on the whole, it's been described as the fact that outer space and the celestial darkness form an integral part of Maori epistemologies, ways of knowing, and ontologies, their ways of being. There is no fundamental distinction between the human and the natural world in Te Ao Maori. The entire world is made up of interconnections understood as whakapapa. And whakapapa means, in effect, a genealogical layering, links between people and other people, people and the environment that are related. Just as we would say your auntie or your uncle, you can apply that same whakapapa or relation to the environment. And this connects them and it creates obligations to, from, and between humankind and the world around us. While again, there are variations, I've put here on the slide the most basic kind of story in relation to this that many Māori accept. We start with the idea of te kore, the void or nothingness. And then from the void comes te po, the darkness, and te ao marama, the light. Te awa turua, the physical world, and this all returns back to te kore. So back to that void or nothingness. And from this void, the darkness emerges, and out comes Ranganui, the sky father, and Papatuanuku, the sky mother. And as the story goes, they were locked into a tight embrace with their children in between them, and they were in complete darkness. Now, the children grew very tired of existing in this darkness, and so they cleaved their parents apart, and they lofted their father, Ranganui, into the heavens, and he became the sky father of the heavens. And in doing so, what the children did is they brought light into the world, each child becoming the parent of a particular specific natural realm. So the children of Papa and Rangi were Tango Tango, who is the manifestation of celestial darkness, and Wainui, who represents the ocean. And between these two sprung the Whanawa Marama. That is the family of lights that adorns the night sky, including those stars of Matariki that we talked about at the beginning. The point is, though, is that there is this genealogical layering. There is this relationship between human beings and the natural world. There is not separation from. It's all together, a holistic view. So what does this mean for us? For us, consequently, Te Ao Maori recognizes outer space and the near-Earth environment without distinction as part of our ecosystem. It takes a holistic approach, and it does not make the sort of distinction that we see with these other legislative frameworks. So in contrast to anthropocentrism of those other frameworks, here ecocentrism says, anthropocentrism is ethically and morally incorrect. Ecocentrism affirms that moral and ethical standing of the environment itself and moves beyond a human-centric view and refers to nature as being intrinsically valued. So it takes a more balanced approach. Now, in light of this, the idea is that we could look at, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, developing legislation that focuses on te ao Māori, and in doing so, move away from that strictly anthropocentric view to one that balances between anthropocentrism and ecocentrism. So what might that legislation look like drawing on te ao Māori? Well, it would recognize Māori as the kaitiaki, or the guardians of the night sky. It could continue to have anthropocentric hooks, such as making reference to the importance of dark skies for future generations, for human health, for economic and energy benefits. But it also offers space to recognize the health and the well-being of the near-Earth environment itself as part of the broader ecosystem. Is this possible? Or is this all just pie in the sky? Well, on the plus side, let's always start with the positive. On the plus side, New Zealand does have a new national space policy, and this came into effect in May 2023. It outlines New Zealand's values and objectives in relation to space, and it's supposed to be used by officials as a tool to help them inform space policy and development. What has it done? Well, importantly, it's made some effort to ensure the participation of Māori, and such participation is reflected in the fact that the policy makes provision for acting in partnership with Māori. And so all I've done on here is just taken a few snippets from the policy itself that show that reference to Māori interest and Māori participation. Importantly as well, our national space policy also makes reference to Te Tiriti, or the Treaty of Waitangi, which is our founding constitutional document. This document, at its core, is about the exercise of public power, and in particular between the Crown, at one time the British Crown, but now the Crown, and Māori. And it requires that in this relationship, there needs to be partnership, protection, and redress. And here in the space policy, it makes explicit reference to the fact that the policy needs to align with and to take consideration of those obligations to work with Māori, so for Māori participation. So on that front, it's quite important, and it's made some strides. And it seems to suggest there might be some momentum here. But the issue is it's just that. It is a space policy. And the danger here is that this policy, if we go back to the very beginning and we think about the Matariki Public Holiday Act, this policy may turn out to be just lip service, glossing over the promotion and the protection of Indigenous rights, including their rights in relation to dark skies and outer space. We have a long history in New Zealand of this lip service that I mentioned at the beginning. So not just in the Matariki Public Holiday Act, but we can also see this in our acts in relation to protecting our rivers and our mountains as well. But if the government uses the policy properly, like a policy is supposed to be used, i.e. the lens through which it should be looked at making any decisions about space, then there's potential here. And it's a uniquely Kiwi document as well. I've looked at the space policies of other colonizer settler states that we often group together and refer to as the Kansas states, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the US. And New Zealand appears to be the only of these countries that has a space policy that makes reference to its Indigenous peoples and provides for Indigenous participation and views, at least as I can find in my research. So that's the positives. What are the negatives? Well, even more recently, in March, April this year, a petition was sent to Parliament to create comprehensive legislation for the protection of dark skies. It went through the petitions committee and then came before Parliament and had its reading. And the government gave its response in April of this year saying, quote, due to other priorities on the government's resource management reform works program, remember I talked about them reforming the RMA. So due to its work in relation to reforming the RMA, the government is not proposing any additional action in response to the report at this time. So thanks, but no thanks. And this really isn't surprising if you know anything about New Zealand politics under our current government, not surprised at all. But nonetheless, we need to continue to push for this type of legislation to actually give teeth to or bark behind that, or bite behind the bark of the Matariki Public Holiday Act to protect our dark skies, which are rapidly running out and under threat, not just to honor Māori and Māori ways of being and our obligations under the Treaty of Waitangi, but for all peoples, dark skies are important for all of us. Thank you very much.
Already at 5. Are there any questions? Wow, a bunch of questions. You want to do?
Usually they're stunned in the silence.
Quick.
Yes,
I cannot.
it's working.
Thank you. This is a short question. Just sort of circling back to what I might have been thinking about with the legislation. Was the fact that some iwi, say the terms in English, but some iwi regard Rigel as the important object starting the new year rather than the Pleiades present any complications for the production of this legislation?
So my response is from what my Māori colleagues that I've worked with on the other piece that I linked in there, no, it didn't seem to factor in, whether it's Matariki or, and he mentioned rival, whatever, protection of dark skies, there didn't seem to be any internal issue in relation to that at all from what my Māori colleague has told me.
Yeah, no, I was wondering about that. It could have been a point of contention.
Yeah, on general.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of Matariki, there is definitely iwi or tribal variation, which the previous question picked up on. There is variation. There's often, as my colleagues describe it, there is perhaps variation in how the ceremonies around Matariki look like. But there's, I don't want to say homogenized in everyone. I don't want to do that, but there's a very broad consensus that Matariki is Māori New Year, and that's a very important time of year, and that is the time for festivities. Perhaps how that is celebrated may have variation. There might be other stars that crop up. In fact, Regal, I've not heard of that before, but
and it would be a different day.
Day, yeah, this, that my colleague told me is also another one of importance as well. But, from what I understand, and I also think, and this is me speaking more as a lawyer and a litigator, is that oftentimes, you will find in Indigenous advocacy, at least I've seen in Indigenous advocacy that I've worked in, there might be a strategic essentialism. So Indigenous peoples as agents actively choose to perhaps not ignore, but maybe put to the side any differences that might exist in relation to maybe some smaller things for the broader point of forwarding a cause or agenda that is important to them. I don't think in any way, from my personal opinion, that denigrates in any way the exercise of agency by Indigenous peoples. In fact, I think it's quite strategic, and it's been used very much by Indigenous peoples under international law to create some quite positive impacts. So I see on that scale in the domestic level, I see that often at play in this kind of strategic, let's set aside A, B, C, and D because we need to focus on primary targets, G, E, and F, or something like that. Was there another question in there that I'm? No.
We do have two more questions.
Sure, two more. Okay,
Yeah.
right.
It's only a very short comment. But exist antecedents of this idea of legislation taking nature or part of nature as subject of human rights. For example, the legislation in Bolivia about the rights of the Pachamama and the constitutional legislation in Ecuador about the rights of nature. These are attempts have 15 years of experience, and I think it's a good starting point to use. But the important fact in this case is the very big force of the indigenous movements in that country, in that time. This is a crucial issue to involve some kind of change in this part.
Thank you. Confined to reclamation from and for the center approach. Because it's my understanding, at least, that they are at least a little bit mutually exclusive. This is the point of extension that places here people in a balance in our community ecosystem and everything that's involved there. It sort of takes the what? You understand what I'm trying to say? Kind of. So are you saying that there's no possibility for overlap between the two? I'm saying I think ecocentrism would encompass the anthropocentric things that you had listed as a part of the whole, and like the point of ecocentrism kind of it doesn't centralize those things. It's more holistic kind of. So what I would respond to that in the discussions that I kind of had with my colleagues around that, who are expert in Te Ao Māori, is that even the idea of anthropocentric and ecocentric are not Māori ideas or Indigenous sorts of ideas. That's still a construct that's in fact imposed and still kind of, does that make sense? Still kind of using that sort of construct. But if we talked about it in that sort of language, Te Ao Māori can find a way to include both or to balance both, and recognizing, and part of this is driven by the fact of the technicalities of New Zealand law. So New Zealand law for Treaty of Waitangi, meaning for there to be application of the treaty to Māori, which would require that partnership and participation, it needs these anthropocentric hooks. That's just part of how it works. So still having some sort of inclusion of an anthropocentric hook there. So talking about things like, still talking about how it's important for human health and that it can have economic benefits. And so recognizing that and still including those provisions within the law, but at the same time, Te Ao Māori coming in and saying that's not the only thing, as you could see with the Matariki, there's no reference at all, even to the environment. So Te Ao Māori being able to step in to recognize Māori and their role as kaitiaki or guardians of the sky, recognizing that whakapapa, that genealogy or that continuous link, that there's no distinction there. And the idea that it's not just about the value that Earth serves or environment serves to human beings, but it's intrinsic value in and of itself. I feel like looking at you, like I feel like I'm not answering your question, or that we need to have a broader discussion.
You kind of that helps you sort of think about how to phrase the question a little bit better.
Okay, should we carry on at some point?
Yeah, we can go there.
Okay.
Last question. We have to get over to slides.
Just a basic question. So when the residency want to develop a sky park or such policy, that's a basic one. What direction from the maybe from the government, from the also maybe from the distribution, maybe from the industry, because we in Malaysia, we want to when have an option with this company, like park the policy in national and state level. The hardest part is the industry said we are going throughout that part of the it and say that I will limit the modern area of the new modern area of Malaysia. So if share our with us about there are some reaction or some maybe any articles in the early stage when one would do the policy in the New Zealand, because we didn't have 9 have already up rather than we Malaysia with 0. Then we in Borneo Island have also really tried, right? And there are a lot of them still, so to say, which area. So we see that this is very important to do a policy. So how much you want Malaysia is very hard to do policy, but maybe you can share.
So actually, the research project that I'm starting in 3 weeks' time, as soon as my ethics approval comes in to the ethics gods, it's actually going around to these dark sky sites to do just that, to interview local communities and figure out what kind of policy and governance we can put in place. And that's what I'm speaking about on Thursday in quite a fair bit of detail. But what it requires at a very practical level is it requires the community to all be on board to want that sky or want that reserve and to follow what the organization Dark Sky International requires. But as a lawyer, what prompted me for the project is I actually still don't understand who regulates the regulator. So who regulates Dark Sky International, and do their standards that they then imposed on sites to become dark sky reserves, where do those come from, and what sort of, are they following human rights law, international law, indigenous rights law, environmental law, or is it? And that's not to say that they aren't. I don't know. It's just it's not clear. So I'm working quite closely with the New Zealand director of that organization. But the biggest challenges in New Zealand, I would say, is education around dark skies and lighting. You tell people that you want dark skies, and then they say crime is going to go up, it's going to be dark, everyone's going to be murdered, everyone's going to be raped, and everyone's going to be robbed, and that it's all downhill. And the lighting industry is a surprisingly powerful industry. So yeah, education programs around it. And what we have seen is when Dark Sky International goes out, and you'll meet her next week. I think Nilani is speaking right after me. They actually go out and do local community education programs to explain to people actually safety increases when you have particular types of lighting. So it's that education that's required, I think, at the most basic level. I think in part the reason that the petition for the legislation failed, and I know the man who drafted it, he's a lovely, lovely astronomer, but I think as a lawyer, I think starting small, perhaps we look at first at a policy, a national policy, which we don't have around it. That could include education. From there, maybe we look at some small amendments, such as to the Matariki Act or to OSHA. And then eventually, perhaps we can get there to an independent freestanding bit of legislation. But interestingly, to be looked out for on the horizon, New Zealand is shooting to become the second dark sky nation in the world. So Niue, our Pacific neighbors, is the first complete dark sky country or nation in the world. So.
That's a nice positive way to.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the room where Clive is speaking opens at 40 past. And it's not too far from here, like a 5-minute walk. I forget what building it's in.
I think it's called school design. Yeah, the Davis building, so it's school design, go up that way towards the building, maybe not meeting them.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry. Almost in our school. So Monday starts at 12. School is over. School back.
Do I need to do anything to, or you're gonna work your magic to get rid of it off the screen?
Is this your laptop? No, it's
No, 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 no.
Oh,
Okay,
nothing to,
just
nothing.
to-
Yep, bright and early. After you. Are you going back to physics or are you going to do life? Huh? I'll go back after one.